Hey everyone, welcome to the Suffolk Legal Innovation and Technology Lab's first Wednesday workshops for the document assembly line community. These workshops are a chance to dive deeper into topics related to building guided interviews with DocAssemble using the document assembly line software and tools. Today's topic is interview user experience design, and our expert guest is Quinten Steenhuis, the LIT Lab co-founder or co-director, and I guess I'd call him the lead architect of the document assembly line. I'll ask him to introduce himself in a minute too. First, this workshop's being recorded. We will share it on our YouTube channel. To find it, just check our blog on suffolklitlab.org or search for Suffolk Lit Lab on YouTube. If you're participating live on Zoom, please use the chat to ask questions. I will keep an eye on out for them and call attention to Quinten as we go. Your video is disabled, but since it often helps to share your screen to demonstrate an issue or a problem, you can do that. Just please wait until we invite you to, if it comes up, if it's relevant. Before we dive in, if you're hearing about the LIT Lab or the document assembly line for the first time, head over to suffolklitlab.org to learn more. Everyone who uses the document assembly line tools or DocAssemble is welcome to attend our weekly community meetings, join our community forum on Microsoft Teams, attend these workshops, our upcoming trainings. If you'd like to join us, just email us at litlab@suffolk.edu. Okay, let's get started. Go ahead and introduce yourself, Quinten, and you can take it from here.
All right, thanks, Sam, for that introduction. It's good to see everybody. If I look like I'm looking off to the side, it's just because my camera is on the side where my screen is. So what I'm hoping today is that you all will be able to unmute and add thoughts if you want. I guess we can use the Zoom chat too, and Sam will relay your thoughts and comments. I know that many of you have expertise in the topic I'm going to share today as well. The other quick preface that I have is today we're not really going to learn a lot about DocAssemble. I really want to focus on the big picture, totally universal concepts that work across any document automation platform. And we're really thinking about the usability of the person's experience when they're working through your form that you build. I will say that I have done versions of presentations with these same slides that were more like an hour and a half. I don't want to use an hour and a half today since we only have 50 minutes. That would be a problem. So I'm going to be responsive to what you're interested in and what you all have to share. And I think we'll be able to start with the big picture and then zoom in with examples. So we'll have a natural break with the time that we have. As Sam said, I'm Quinten Steenhuis. I'm the co-director of the LIT Lab. I've been doing document automation for many years, since I think 2016 is when I started really getting into it. So about 9 years, starting in Hot Docs, moving on to DocAssemble, which I quickly saw as one of the best platforms to do this in. Care a lot about user experience and usability of the tools that we build. I've done that across the world, including as a consultant. And when we have a chance to do usability tests, I think that's one of the best ways for us to learn. So some of the things that I'm going to share are based on things that we've just tried and gotten feedback from real users on. Some of them from collected information we've had from usability audits that we had done by other experts in this field, and reading and thinking about this for quite a long time. But there's not always one right answer. A lot of these questions are situational. So there's room for debate, but I like to think that at least I have a basis for my strong opinions on these questions. One of my favorite folks in this field of form usability, Caroline Jarrett, we'll talk about a little bit more in the presentation, said, I have lots of opinions about forms, most of which people don't want to hear. Hopefully people want to hear my opinions a little bit more, but they're as strong as Caroline's, I think, in a lot of ways. So here's the topic, right? You want to make your guided interview good. That's what we're going to try to answer today, how you do that. And I want to start with this little illustration here of why this matters. And you might think, well, we can just kind of put the questions out there and it will just work. So what are some problems with this user interface for this form here? And I know you're all muted and it might be harder to participate with the cameras off and being muted, but if you have a thought and want to drop it in the chat, feel free to. Has the developer of this form chosen good input types for their questions?
Absolutely not.
Yeah. And Samir, like, what's the problem?
I mean, it's ripe for error, first and foremost, and then you have absolutely insane numbers and uh, huge limitations on what variable inputs could be. So not only is he not efficient and takes a lot of time to do, um, but also mouse being tricky increases the likelihood of error.
This is obviously like a super extreme example, right, of a problem with choosing inputs. But I'm just going to submit to you all that there are lots of smaller places where these choices can make a big difference too. We have to think carefully on each screen of our interview, what questions we put together on that screen, what kind of inputs we choose, how we guide people to that screen, and what we do with them when they leave that screen and they leave our interview overall. So that's what we're going to talk about today. And this matters because a lot of times the tools that we're building here in the lab and that I've worked with around the world, they're often very high stakes. People are in an emotional state. They're dealing with something that matters a lot for their well-being. They're not at the point where they're able to devote the most energy and attention to this process, even if it's really important. There's lots of studies that show that being in an emotionally burdened state makes it harder for you to process information. I mentioned usability testing already. I'll say it again. There's really no substitute for usability testing. The only way that you know if your form is good or not is to put it in front of real users and to observe them using it. You can't ask them what's wrong or what they like or don't like. But if you watch them and you see where they have trouble, you will quickly learn things about your tool that you cannot learn from an expert or from analyzing it in any other way. That said, we're going to cover heuristics, things that you kind of get you to a good starting place. You don't want to have to reinvent every part of your interview every time, and you don't need to if you start with a good foundation. So at the top, this is what I think are the things we should be thinking about that make an interview good or bad. So we're thinking about things from the user's point of view. We want to know, can they understand the prompts and other instructions? There's text in your interview. Can they actually make use of that, right? Can they understand it? Given the constraints of the form that they're working with, can they accurately provide the information that the form expects them to provide? Do they have the ability to provide a complete response, not just accurate, covering everything they need to say? You make that easy for them. And then on the other side of that, there are things that are inevitable burdens that come with filling in a form. You're taking the user's time. You are maybe putting them in an emotionally vulnerable situation. And those are things that you need to keep in mind too. Burdens are not necessarily avoidable, but we have to balance them and make sure they're appropriate for the benefit that the user is getting. Can we maybe save them time by cutting out redundant questions? Can we reduce the trauma that they might experience filling out the form by having them only have to tell their story once rather than multiple times, at least the traumatic parts? And these are really the levers that we have to affect the user's experience. So we can give them help and context on any given screen. We can think about the structure and the order of the questions, making sure that's a sequence that's easy for them to process and use. We get to choose inputs, like that really extreme example of the drop-down for everything. We can think about our vocabulary and the way that we write, paying attention to plain language. And we can also think about things like formatting and layout of text. So it's easy for people to chunk, process, find the important facts really quickly without having to slow down and read long chunks of text that are really dense. And you might think basically, right, our job is to be a navigator for that person through a certain process. And like a navigator, we're not just throwing them out there and to figure it out on their own. We help orient them. If you think of a map, it says like, you are here often, right? If you're at an important location, that's part of what we want to do for our users. Let them know where they are, let them know if they're making the right trip, and let them know what's going to happen when they're done. Those are all the things that we have to keep in mind. And we can think of like really good navigation experiences we've encountered. I actually really like the highway signage in New York State. And I think also it's using a familiar vocabulary for us, right? We know right away how to interpret these different signs, the arrows, the labels, even the shape of the different symbols on the signs. Those give us information that's familiar to us. We're not expecting the person to learn something new each time they use a highway. We also can imagine, I think a lot of us here are in the Boston area, we are familiar with experiencing very confusing intersections. This is not in Boston. I think this is in Japan, maybe in Tokyo. But this was a really good, one of the most confusing street layouts I could think of that I found when I was searching around on Flickr. So, right, like, where do you go? What's the right place to be in? Those are all things that are kind of missing from this street experience here. So I'm going to kind of go quickly through this part because I really do like the Caroline Jarrett and Gaffney framework that they've created to help think about the kind of choices, the questions we're asking our users. But it's not the most important part we're going to be able to do today. So they proposed this idea that every kind of information you ask for a user can be grouped into one of these 4 categories. So you have slot-in information, gathered, third party, and created. So we'll go through those. So a slot-in question is something you know off the top of your head, something you don't have to think. It's kind of automatic to provide it. What's your name? What's your address? What's your phone number? You're not having to slow down and remember that information. You know it. The next level of complexity, putting a higher burden on the user, is gathered information. So this is something that you need to get from some source that's easy for you to access, like maybe pulling out your wallet and finding your driver's license number. I know the first 3 digits now, finally, of my driver's license number, but I don't have it memorized. I can still easily get it. It's just a little bit slower and more effort than a slot-in field. And the next level is when you have to get it from a third party. So if a form asks you, what is your spouse's income? What's the address of their employer, right? Like those are things you can get, but it's going to take more time. And it might actually have you putting down the interview to do a separate task and then come back to the interview. And the last category is created fields. Created fields, it's not just like you're gathering information from somewhere, whether it's from your head or someone else's head. It's something that didn't exist in the world yet. It's something that you had to create from scratch, that maybe you're being forced to encounter and make a decision about, or construct a narrative on the spot. So notice something about these 4 categories of information. Obviously, we've gotten to the most complex when we get to a created field. We're not saying that created fields it's not just about what the input is like on the form. So here is a created field that is just a checkbox, one simple tick mark that the person has to use to interact with to provide this answer. I would like a trial with a judge or a judge and a jury. But think about a real world situation that I ran into, which is working on an eviction defense interview here in Boston. That was something we had on our pro se forms forever at Greater Boston Legal Services, where I was working when I built it. But when I started putting this into our tool, we saw from analytics that really quickly people were starting to drop off at a question about whether they should ask for a jury or not. And it makes sense. Before they had started using our tool, they had no idea that there was even a possibility of having a jury trial for their eviction case. It's a totally foreign concept. They didn't really have enough information to decide if they should do that or not. So we use that information to tweak the question to make it easier to answer, to provide a little bit more guidance and also kind of reassure people that there wasn't necessarily a wrong choice there. So we didn't get that drop off anymore. But perfect example of a created question that did not require a big open-ended text field. It was just a checkbox. So thinking about this is about like what kind of information is being asked for, not the form of the input that the user has to provide it with. So thinking about this first prong, and I'm definitely invite people to chime in with ideas about things that they've experienced on the chat, and I'll try to highlight those as we go through, because I think you all are going to be thinking about examples of your own as we do this. The first prong that we have for the user's experience is their ability to understand the information that we put into the form. Usually it's things like instructions, labels for fields, that kind of information we're sending to them. The biggest thing that you might have been familiar with already is this concept of readability. There are all kinds of tools like readability measures, which say this is the grade level of this text. That can be a helpful lever to use to understand whether your text is readable and understandable. But these are, I think, the biggest points to make for this. Like, keep text short. Don't throw a lot of text at the user. Everything that you give them, they have to process and read and understand. The less you say, the better. But don't, obviously, you need to say enough so that they know what to do. Use familiar vocabulary, I think, is the best way to really understand readability on a form, is to think about, are the words that I'm using common words that the person understands? A word list that we often like to use is the Dale Chall word list. This is from like the 40s, and there's been an update in the 1980s. It looked at the most common 4,000 words in the English language. It's a really good place to start, and you should really justify whenever you leave if you're using words that are outside of that most common 4,000 or so words when you're building tools for the general public. The other thing we can think about is using short sentences that are written in the active voice, that we avoid passive voice sentences. And we use direct address, things like using the word you when we're talking to a person using the form, rather than words like plaintiff or defendant, to help the person know that they're answering this question the right way. The other thing we can think about are the rest of the things I try to avoid reading off the slide here, but this really is the key here for design, thinking about what are the levers we have. Remember, we don't want to reinvent the wheel with the layout of our forms. So there's usually not that many places where we're going to be making individual design decisions, but we are thinking about how we group fields together, keeping related fields together and related screens in the right order, thinking about using bulleted lists whenever we can to help make it easier for somebody to process that information. And I really love this Robin, I think Robin Williams, maybe it's Robin Williams. And I might have her book here somewhere on my shelf. I'm looking up. It's above my computer here. I'm forgetting her last name. Maybe Roberta Williams. Yeah. Okay. I do have it. Yeah. Yeah, Robin Williams. Okay, so here's her book. It's a great book, The Non-Designer's Design Book. And she came up with this really nice mnemonic crap, which contrast, repetition, alignment, and proximity. If you don't want to be as profane, you can rearrange those letters and make them carp instead. But I think it's memorable this way. Those are kind of like the key design ideas to keep in mind. Just a quick example here. So looking at this, since we're not being able to be too interactive in this format, try to pick up a couple of details from this screen about what you need to know about a name change, and then compare it to this version here, which is the same information. You probably have a preference. I'll point out the things that I'm noticing on it, and people can chime in on the chat too. Right away, by chunking this into 4 parts, what do we know? What is that conveying? Just having these 4 paragraphs with 4 different headings. And you can put this in the chat if you want. A little awkward to use the chat here, I think. So I'll answer. So we know there are 4 things to know, right? We know their steps, Michael. Yes, exactly. And also we know there are 4 steps, right? That's already information that we know. We know by the headings here that are in a different, they're bold, and that's the main difference that we've used. That's the contrast part here, right? The headings are bold. That is a summary of the information is in the paragraph underneath it. So we know these are things we need to do. If we want to know more about any of these things, like a lot of people might be wondering, wait a second, what's this whole thing about me publishing my name change here? I don't know if people picked that up when they saw the first version of this at all. Then right away you might be knowing that's the place you want to start to zoom in on. You might have known where your birth certificate is and kind of guess you need to provide that. You knew about the hearing, but this is the thing you want to look at closer, right? So headings are really helpful to help people focus on important information. This is using repetition here. 1, 2, 3, 4, right? So we're using the same style in each of these. These little details make a big difference for how people understand and can process information. I use this illustration here to help think through. Has anyone ever had the experience of walking through a doorway and then you forget the reason you entered that room? As you get older, it starts to happen more. It happens to me for sure. This is a real psychological effect, right? The doorway effect. And I would submit to you that whenever you click the next button in a guided interview, you're having something like that doorway experience for the user. So when we let someone click the next button, they're kind of starting over in a little bit of a way with the information that their context of the interview has changed when they click next. We want to think about how we put those breaks so that the person isn't losing information that they've kind of had at the forefront of their mind. So breaking up a series of questions into multiple screens, if the information is really closely related, if they have to remember what they said on the previous screen to answer the next screen without being repetitive or redundant, you probably want to change that so that those questions are on the same screen. Okay, so that's kind of comprehensibility. The next thing that I mentioned at the beginning was accuracy. How do you help people give accurate answers? Saying less is a good thing to start with here too. So the less that we say, the more likely it is that people are going to know what to say what we actually want them to take away from that. And I'm going to see if I can find an annotation arrow here. Here we go. No, that's a stamp. Yeah, that's okay. My annotation's not the normal one here. So sometimes having short questions that are easy to understand that people can accurately answer actually means providing more questions. And we'll have some examples of that in a second. I think we'll be able to get to those. Another way to improve accuracy is to not make the person give answers to you. So if, for example, on a form, it might say something about a date that's 10 days from today. You can do that math for the person. If it has a total, which is the total that you and your spouse earn, or the total for all of your expenses, in a family law form, maybe you do the math for the person. You don't make them do that, right? We can also improve it by allowing them to say they don't know the answer. If the form makes it seem like they have to provide a response, they might put in a response that's wrong. So if you can possibly put an I don't know in there, you're going to get more accurate answers. We saw an extreme example of the input type choice and why that matters. The other thing we can do, but carefully, is use input validation. I say use it carefully because often our instincts about input validation are wrong. We might not understand problems that come with our validation choices. So we want to be humble about when we use it. And certainly we want to do a little user testing maybe when we can. I think I have some examples of that. So Michael or David, you had mentioned calendar controls for dates. So here's an example of that kind of idea, right? So we think we're going to ask for a date. Not every date is really a date in the way that we can validate it using traditional date format. So here's an example from our 209A restraining order, and Caroline is the one who's on the call as well, who helped a lot in this interview. I'm pulling a lot of examples from this, and I'm not taking credit for these. These were a team effort with Caroline Robinson helping with a lot of these choices. So one is here, like when did something happen in the past? In this example, it's about an incident of abuse. Okay, we could put a date field there. What happens if the person puts the wrong date? From a legal point of view, what's going to happen if they get on the stand and they're off by a day or 2 days or 3 days? What are we doing there? We're inviting a chance for them to get cross-examined about something that didn't ultimately matter. They didn't have to say the exact day. Let's let them be a little bit broader in how they phrase that date. So here we ask them to say the year it happened. That seems like a reasonable limit on how precise they're going to be. And then they can be as precise as they want underneath with the rest of the day and month. Another example here, the 209A restraining order form asks for how old somebody is. Well, that's the point of it. It's identifying the defendant. We could ask for their birth date. We could make a person put in a birth date. Do you know everybody's birth date that's in your life? Maybe not. Maybe not, especially when you're filling in a high stakes form like this, where you might be stressed. So we let people put in an estimate instead. So it seems like a date, but really it's asking for an age. We want to let them be specific if they know. We want to let them be fuzzy if they don't. Another example, similar, very similar to the first one. So this is just a different way to do it. This is a one line open text field for the date, but we're using validation that just checks to make sure there's a 4-digit year that starts with 19 or 20 inside the text. So we're just using a simple substring search there to check for that little bit of information in there. But it's one field rather than separate for year and the rest of the date, because that's plenty accurate enough again here. More examples of being careful with input choices and validation. So when is a number not a number? All kinds of things in our life are called numbers that are not strictly numeric. So things like phone numbers. People would get really annoyed if you used a number input here for their phone number, because they wouldn't be able to put in things like spaces, plus symbols, dashes, and parentheses that they use to be able to help them accurately type out a phone number. So this is not a number. This is a text field that has special formatting rules, maybe. Very easy with phone numbers to get validation wrong, because there are many different ways people format phone numbers around the world. So if you had strict like US style formatting of the number, you would prevent people from being able to put in international numbers, which they might have, and then they might need to provide on a form. Okay, so here, this example from the 209A again is about how we could break up questions in a guided interview to improve the person's ability to answer them. This was the original here. This is what the form says. This little box that's inset just had these 7 choices, and we've broken those instead into multiple screens that I think are a lot easier for someone to answer accurately. So first of all, we provided checkboxes. These relationships here are not exclusive. So we make it clear to that by making them checkboxes here. We don't want people to get confused about being engaged in the past and now married. Those both can be true, and I think are usually true. So we just let them provide all the answers that are true. I don't have that interview pulled up to go through more of the screens, but I can tell you, like, basically we took this, and it's 10 screens that I think each are very easily comprehensible and that provide some reassurance to help the person answer it accurately. Here is one of the kind of trickier parts of the form. So it says blood relative. One of the things that we realized is that people might be confused by that kind of antiquated term. And what the court actually meant by blood relative was more expansive than a genetic relationship. So someone who's an adopted family member, for example, is a blood relative. So that little extra help there in context was important to give. Lots of ways we could have asked for something like height and weight. What we landed on was an open field that let the person quickly type it out the way that they prefer. And then we just make sure that they use something like a unit. So this is allowed for us because the paper form wasn't limited that way. But we wanted to make sure that someone didn't write an answer in centimeters or stones or kilograms and have it interpreted as being in pounds or inches or feet, right? So we just let them put in the number and we just enforce that there is a unit provided. A lot more we could talk about there. I guess I'll try to save like the last 10 minutes for people to react and share what they thought of as we went through. Talked about comprehension, accuracy, last prong here of the user understanding. What we say is getting a complete response. So some overlap. We can use shorter, answerable, smaller questions to break up long, open-ended narrative questions that the user might otherwise be faced with. Again, partial and I don't know answers. Important part of getting a complete response is letting people know what they don't have to say. Using examples can help with getting good responses. Using options where they are comprehensive enough and having some option to like customize the response if your predefined options aren't covering every scenario. And then the other thing we can do is we can help them review and confirm important choices that they're making in the interview to help check them to make sure that they didn't forget something they needed to say, especially if you break questions into multiple screens. They might not know when they get to say something, and they might forget to say it because they think the question that's going to be asking about that is coming later. So slowing down and letting them see what they've already said is really helpful there. Here is the 209A restraining order form again. And the way that this is handled in Massachusetts is a big open text box on the paper form, the PDF, with this little bit of instruction, how to do it correctly. As you can imagine, people who are doing this totally on their own often leave out important facts that the judge needs to know to be able to decide if they qualify for a restraining order. So this can be a huge problem, this form design. Here's what the same question looks like in Washington State. It does not have to be the way that we do it in Massachusetts. So they have these 4 pages represent the same questions that are asked for on this one page in Massachusetts. You can see that the person is slowed down. They're using techniques like contrast, repetition and alignment, proximity, headings, bold formatting, bullets. These all kind of break up the instructions that are still there. They're not trying to compress it into this tiny little 4 lines. And they've also broken it into multiple questions that slow the user down. They provide options and categories to help them provide accurate answers. So we slow down and we ask about things like medical treatment, substance abuse. Here's some options they can choose from. Again, great use of the I don't know. All of the things that are really important to say to the judge to get a restraining order, they've broken those into separate questions. Now that can be a bit repetitive in some circumstances, but I think really important in a high stakes, emotionally charged interview process like this one. Okay. So something that we can do in the guided interview process is, and we have done in Massachusetts, is we've broken this really long open narrative into smaller checkpoints to help someone make sure they're saying everything they need to say. Okay, so what else can we do here? One of the bullets on the previous screen was progressive disclosure. So here's an example of help that's offered in context. This little arrow expands when someone clicks this. They get the help information in context. They're not forced to read it before they can see the inputs. But if they want to know, they can click and get more information. If they move on and they do want to get money in the lawsuit, we have to slow and ask them questions here about whether they qualify for, in Massachusetts, the 93A consumer protection law. So providing some of this responsiveness on the same screen can really improve the user experience. I'm just going to walk you through what that looks like. So if I've answered no, there's a path here where I click yes, and then I'm done, because that person is not subject to consumer protection law when they are a housing authority, a public housing authority, like a city or county government, essentially, quasi-governmental agency. But we keep going with more questions if they've given a negative response until finally we get a complete answer. So the advantage, I'm showing this on two screens here, but really it's one screen the person can scroll. The advantage is that they have a chance to see and react to their answers and see what changing the answer gives. If they're not sure about something, they can click and see what happens and then understand, oh, this was actually what I meant to say. So that's a pattern to use sometimes too. Okay. I'm going to highlight a couple of ideas. So short is a theme that is consistent throughout here. Let's give some examples for some of these. Affirmations, respecting the user, and signposting. So let your user use their words to describe themselves. Use words like need rather than want. Don't say please, because it usually comes across as insincere. So here's an example of using the word need rather than want. Here's an example of a signpost, which is also kind of doubling as an affirmation for the user. They've gotten through a lengthy interview process. They're not quite done. They're almost done. So we slow down, we let them know, hey, you're almost done. Someone, Nicole Braddock from Theory and Principle, she used a really great example on a conference panel that I saw once where it was, if you do the New York Times crossword, when you get 3/4 of the way through, it says, hey, you've reached 75%. Those kind of affirmations help us keep going. Would you use this if it was a 10-question interview? No. It's really important to kind of understand when you're slowing the user down and when you're kind of helping them be encouraged to keep going. Another affirmation, hey, Jane, you can do this. And then we also have a specific reason to offer this affirmation. Someone using this interview up to code is complaining about problems in their house. We want to let them know it's a safe thing to do. And we explain to them why it is a safe thing to do. I'm going to go through these because I want to, like I said, I want to save about 10 minutes for your reactions and thoughts. So some examples of more affirming language choices. Rather than victim, we can say survivor. Is the gender important to say? If not, use a gender neutral term. So some gender neutral terms like parent, sibling of parent. This one's a little more awkward because it's less common in English. So you might offer all three. With something like homeless, we could say experiencing homelessness. First of all, it's not a permanent condition. It's not an attribute of the person. And it puts the emphasis on the problem that we're trying to solve, right? We're trying to help them through the experience of being homeless. We're not treating them as a homeless person. That's not the important part. Think about whether, like we just had blood relative before as an example, is the relationship that you're trying to describe, is it actually what you care about? Do you need someone to be a parent, or is like a guardian going to be in the same situation for your form? You should say that if that's the case, so people know they're doing it correctly and they feel like they're included. Similarly, spouse or his partner, really what you care about. Doesn't matter if they're married or not. These are the choices that we find are most inclusive for gender, male, female, non-binary, and prefer not to say. And hold on, move. Okay. So here's an example of direct address. And again, I could, like I said, I could do this for an hour and a half. I won't do that. I want to leave you wanting a little bit more rather than trying to cram it in here. So let me pause there. I want to show you one more thing. We're almost done with the examples there, but I still don't think it's helpful for us to go through all of them. Okay. Here is our website, assemblyline.suffolklitlab.org. What we have been doing is we've been gathering all of these kind of helpful tips on our website. If you go to the documentation tab here, and then you click on writing good questions, I want you to use this as a resource. And in the last few weeks, we've even added a lot more examples of how to do things in the way that we think works well. This is our style guide we use internally. We help reinforce it with our students, and we welcome contributions, ideas, thoughts from people all over the world to help expand it. We even have here some examples of very specific ways to ask specific kinds of questions about things like gender, pronouns, and how to ask for somebody's language again. So a resource that you can keep using. And yeah, I'll drop a link to this in the chat. So with that, I'll stop talking and hear from you. I hope.
I dropped a link in there for you. And
Thanks, Sam.
while others are coming up with follow-up questions, here's mine is what is or some of the least intuitive to you best practices that you can think of? And like please is one of those for me,
Yeah.
just be polite is something we're all raised with. But I'm wondering if there's some other ones that are less obvious to me that you might have come across.
That's a great way to phrase the question. I don't have one that comes to mind exactly as you're asking, but I would say that I'm always struggling to cut information. And I do know, like, the less I say, the easier it is for people to understand. But your first instinct when you're trying to explain something is just to say more. And I don't get to edit myself on this talk. I'm probably saying more than I should say or need to say here, but I'm always cutting. That's usually the thing that makes my work better, is to cut text.
Well, it's been my experience that working with courts, organizations, that in designing interviews, I have a lot less experience from you, but it has been my experience so far that they often want to do the opposite, which is explain more and more. We have to tell them. If we don't tell them this, we'll be doing a disservice. How do you approach that conversation?
Depends on where you come in as a trusted expert and where you are acting as a client, or rather as like a contractor where you are like, they're like, just do what we tell you. So I always try to approach that diplomatically, and really push on it where I think it will have an impact or value, and move on when I'm like, I won't change their mind and it's not a good place to spend capital. So I think something we can do sometimes is at least to put it behind one of those little accordions that I was showing, where the information can be hidden unless the person clicks and affirmatively wants to read it. Another thing that I think I'm pretty well can persuade people of is including links to other websites is not often a great idea, because people get lost, especially on a smartphone. You probably have experienced this. You click on a link, say to a PDF, and then you're like, wait, phone, how do I get back to the thing I was just working on? Will it still be there when I get back to it? Usually it can help to like summarize it and put it on the page at least. Don't let them click somewhere else.
That's a really good point of where there's a huge difference between the user design and user testing on a phone versus a tablet or a laptop. Like people don't lose tabs in their browser as much on a laptop, but on a phone, it's a totally different thing.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Even on a desktop, though, I will tell you. So, like, the other thing I will say, like, I really want to reinforce how great usability testing can be. On a project we were working on, the Up to Code one, I had some screenshots for there. We saw with usability testing a really dramatic variety of devices. So we saw people with very small laptop screens. Information we thought was visible above the fold was not, and it made it really hard for them to know what to do on the front page of our interview. They were already lost right away. So we redesigned that with that in mind. We had people on smaller smartphones and ran into problems there as well. that helped us think through about like how much information we want to put there and how to lay it out so they can absorb it all.
Michelle points out the difficulty with name fields, which I think you probably touched on, and how they can be radically different across cultures and countries. And I think that's a popular design challenge, right? Is how do you do a name field? I know that we've come down on having fairly traditional first, middle, last name fields, I think. How did that come about and what was the thinking behind it?
What we found was that we wanted to help people accurately provide their information in a way that fit the form we were kind of stuck with, because a lot of what we started doing is automating existing forms that already asked for information that way. So we didn't have a lot of flexibility there. I really pushed the beginning of our project to make things like a last name optional, but we got a lot of pushback from folks and people like courts that were like, no, it all has to be required. Similarly with addresses, we've had gone round and round on which information is required in an address. And we ended up.
You've talked about zip codes, for example, like lots
yeah.
of people don't know their own zip code.
Right. So we've kept that optional, I think, but yeah.
Byron says, how do you think about having a user scroll down on one screen versus clicking next to a new screen? Do you have a rule of thumb? And this mirrors kind of Michelle's question, which is they find it really difficult to put a single question on each page. To her, it seems frustrating, but user testing seems to show it can help people answer more accurately. Does seem like related questions.
So my rule of thumb, a lot of like rules of thumb you might already know work pretty well here. Like the 80-20 Pareto rule is probably pretty good for a lot of things. Like the last 20% of your form takes 80% of your work probably. I like the rule of 7 for how many fields should be on a screen. So I think really carefully about putting more than 7 or so fields on one screen. That usually is a good place to take to the next screen. How do I decide what should go on the same screen? It's all about that doorway effect and keeping related information together. If you separate, like if we took that, some of those questions from the 209A where they're all related to like one little thing, like what was the thing that happened that's driving you to be able to make this question to the court to ask for this petition? And we split that onto too many screens. The chance the person's going to say the wrong thing in the wrong place is going to raise. So we want to avoid separating related information.
Would this be different too, depending on the user? Like I could imagine wanting a lawyer who's used to doing this kind of a thing might be more comfortable seeing all of the options on one page. Whereas if you're guiding a self-represented litigant through the process for the very first time, it's probably a lot easier to step them through it gradually.
Yeah, you're right. The user makes a difference there too. So if we design a form for an attorney to fill out or an advocate in a legal aid organization or in a law firm, we might put more things on the same screen because for them, maybe it's about efficiency and repeated use. And if it's a self-represented person, tending more towards breaking the questions up. Yeah.
David asks about how to approach squeezing text into limited spaces on PDF forms.
Something we ran into with that is the challenge with names. So people's names can be any length, right? People have super long names. No one likes to have an extra page for the person's name to go on. So we change the font size dynamically for things like somebody's name. Otherwise, we create an addendum on the fly. So we use a character limit and we automatically overflow that text to a new document that's attached to the main one.
Got a couple more questions here. Stephanie Myers says you don't recommend links. What if it opens in a new window or tab so the user doesn't get lost? Is that enough?
No, I've seen people get lost in that exact circumstance. So yeah, I mean, you're right. It is worse if it replaces the screen they're already in, I think. But people do get lost on their phone, and we've seen people struggle with that in usability testing. Something we really could see directly from the way that real users interacted with the tools there.
Michelle mentions, I'm not sure exactly what this was. I think, probably for multiple questions on one screen versus one on the screen. one way is sort of roll over information and remind the user of information they've already entered, which can be a tool for helping them not lose their place.
Yeah, absolutely. Yep. And that's something that you can do with a signpost too. You can use signposts to help them understand what they've already told you and kind of confirm it. And we use that. I think I have some examples here. Yeah. Right. So here we're summarizing like what are the things you've already said? What does the impact of that? You have a defense. It's like halfway through the interview. We can do things like review screens that slow them down. And you can have those at different key points in the interview too. It's just always a balance of like helping slow them down enough and not slowing them down too much.
Maybe a place to wrap up. One more question from Rami. Started debating how much is too much. How do you know? How do you find the happy medium between giving lots of information and accommodating people who might need less or want less or have trouble with more?
Sure. Yeah, that's a great point. I mean, when I say like saying less, it really means like trying to like convey less of the details. And like it's really hard for lawyers to do because we know and live in the details. You can't really convey every nuance of every situation, but you might need to use a longer sentence to use simple language to explain a concept to somebody. You have to be careful about how many concepts you really need to explain. But yes, you might use more words for that more complicated concept.
I guess my instinct is if knowing the information or knowing the answer to the question doesn't matter, it doesn't need to be on the page. But there are times when people want to know anyway, and so it's not in every situation. But
that's true. I mean, that's something else, right? Like lawyers often assume people want to be educated about the law. That might be true sometimes. Not usually when they're using a guided interview. They're usually trying to get the thing that it produces, not to like learn about the law. So there's other places you can educate them. You can educate them with a document that comes out with the form that they can read at their own pace and time. Often our tools are embedded into a help page. So they can do the reading then, and then they make the action-oriented step to use our tool. It's all about meeting them where they are.
And now I'll ask my wrap-up question. I think I know where you'll go with this, but if somebody is really if this doesn't feel right for them, if they're like, well, my users probably want something else, or you don't actually have a style guide entry for this question I have, I suspect the answer is we'll go test it with your users and see what the answer is, right?
I'll pull another book, which is another great book, this is a Boston, Greater Boston, at least resident. Don't Make Me Think. Great book that tells you can do a usability test with like a couple $100, like literally $100, and a couple hours of time. So just do them, not do them cheap. Don't try to make them perfect. Just do them. I'm going to disagree with Michelle. You do not need your real users to do usability testing. You learn a lot from any users. You're not trying to do like a user research where you need their actual lived experiences. You're just seeing where a person who doesn't already know your tool runs into problems.
I've heard somewhere, I can't remember if it was in that book or another, it's definitely in a design book, that you'll discover something like 80% of the issues with 5 testers. And so it doesn't have to be a massive test. Like even 2 or 3 will highlight some things you hadn't thought about in almost every case. So
yeah, you have a huge drop off. I think the Nielsen Norman group has that, maybe that where those numbers are coming from.
Probably, yeah.
They've shown like 3 is going to get you almost all the time. Most of the questions, 80%, and like 5 is going to get really almost all of them. Once you get to number 6, 7, 8, real drop off, you just start to see repeated problems, the same ones you already learned with your first tests. And yes,
maybe
Michelle, you don't want someone who already knows the law to test. Right. Totally right about that. Yeah.
And maybe part of it too is there's a difference between user testing, which is giving your thing to somebody and watching them use it and asking people what they think about it or asking for feedback. Those are different things.
Yeah, it's very rarely useful to have someone tell you what's wrong with your tool unless they're really an expert in building usable tools. they won't know why they don't like it or how to fix it. They'll come with lots of ideas that will not be helpful. You have to actually
Yeah.
see real people using it to see where they stumble.
I think that's the time we have for today. So thank you so much, Quinten. And for those of you in the audience, thank you so much for coming. Thanks for your questions and your comments and your thoughts. I posted a couple of links through there. If you want to know, if you want to sign up for the rest of these workshops, I mean, I think you're all on the list already, so maybe I'm not speaking to anybody who needs that. But you can find those links on suffolklab.org. You can also find information about our upcoming Legal Innovation and Technology Conference, and you can register for that. It's on April 7th, and we'd love to see you there. If you're here, you're likely interested in that too. And if you're interested in our trainings, I posted the link in the chat as well. Thanks so much for coming.
Thanks, everybody.